happens when traffickers no longer rely on threats or intimidation, but instead use chemistry to silence children. That shocking reality came to light in El Paso, where investigators uncovered that innocent-looking candy was deliberately laced with THC, the psychoactive substance found in marijuana, and administered to children as young as 5 years old during cross-border smuggling operations. According to federal case files and multiple international news outlets, this tactic was not an accident or a minor detail. It represented a calculated method designed to keep children quiet, sedated, and compliant throughout the journey. The discovery began when Border Patrol agents noticed something unusual during what was supposed to be a routine traffic stop. The children in the vehicle appeared unnaturally lethargic, barely responsive to simple questions. Medical examinations later confirmed the presence of THC in their systems, with toxicology reports indicating doses tailored to their body weight. This revealed a chilling level of planning. The traffickers had converted what should have been symbols of joy sweets and candy into tools of control and exploitation. Analysts describe this as a disturbing escalation in trafficking tactics. Historically, smugglers have relied on fear or physical confinement to keep victims under control, but the deliberate drugging of minors represents an industrialized and clinical approach, turning human beings into subdued cargo. Western experts in counter-trafficking have warned that such methods demonstrate how cartels are constantly innovating, adapting to law enforcement pressure with increasingly ruthless measures. Dr. Maria Sanchez of El Paso Children's Hospital underscored the medical danger, noting that even limited doses of THC can cause long-term cognitive impairment and severe psychological trauma in children. This method also fits into a broader global trend. In conflict zones such as Ukraine, investigative reports from Reuters and Defense News have documented how vulnerable populations, including displaced children, are often manipulated with food medication or false promises to facilitate illegal transfers. While the contexts differ, the underlying strategy is the same: weaken the victim's ability to resist, reduce visibility to authorities, and streamline the criminal process. In the Middle East, where Israel and Iran's proxy conflicts often intersect with human smuggling experts, note that narcotics have been used both as currency and as control mechanisms for vulnerable groups. For the United States, the use of THC-laced candy represents more than just a domestic criminal case. It illustrates how transnational networks test new methods on America's doorstep. These tactics, once proven effective, can be replicated and spread across multiple regions from Arizona to California, and even adapted in Europe, where border authorities already face rising challenges with smuggling networks linked to the war in Ukraine. NATO intelligence units have raised alarms about trafficking routes being exploited not only for human cargo, but also for clandestine weapons transfers. The chilling overlap is clear. Wherever borders are porous, traffickers exploit the gaps with ruthless efficiency. The human dimension, however, remains at the core of this story. Behind every piece of candy was a child, stripped of agency, sedated into silence, and treated as expendable. That image has resonated far beyond Texas, forcing policymakers to confront the reality that trafficking is not only about movement across borders, but also about the methods of control used along the way. The fact that this strategy unfolded on U.S. soil in the shadow of communities who believe themselves far from the horrors of international smuggling raises urgent questions. If traffickers can so easily mask sedatives inside something as ordinary as candy, how prepared are border security forces to detect such tactics in real time? And how can communities be trained to recognize signs of chemical control in children before it is too late? These are questions that federal agents, military strategists, and local communities alike must urgently address. The unraveling of this smuggling operation began with what seemed like a routine encounter on the roads of El Paso County. Border Patrol agents pulled over a vehicle, a standard procedure carried out thousands of times each year. Yet what they found inside transformed an ordinary inspection into one of the most disturbing revelations in recent memory. The children traveling in the back seat appeared listless, drowsy, and unable to respond coherently to simple questions. Their silence was not the typical nervousness of young migrants caught in a tense situation. It was something deeper, something clinical. Medical examinations confirmed suspicions. Toxicology reports revealed deliberate administration of THC carefully dosed to the children's body weight. For investigators, this was the smoking gun. The traffickers had weaponized chemistry using narcotics disguised as sweets to ensure silence and compliance. Federal prosecutors immediately recognized the potential scale of the operation, and what began as a single traffic stop spiraled into a multi-agency investigation involving Homeland Security Investigations ICE and local law enforcement. Seasoned border analysts highlight how this discovery illustrates the unpredictability of trafficking cases. What starts as a traffic infraction can quickly escalate into exposure of a sophisticated network. A retired ICE officer described it as peeling back a rotten onion. Each layer revealed more complexity and deeper criminal intent. Officials later confirmed that the traffic stop led directly to intelligence on safe houses, recruitment strategies, and financial channels sustaining the network. The timing of this bust carries international significance. In September 2025, NATO intelligence assessments noted a surge in cartel experimentation with new methods of human control, echoing tactics used in conflict regions such as Syria and Ukraine. Smuggling organizations were increasingly adopting tools of psychological and chemical manipulation once reserved for battlefield environments. Experts at Jane's Defense Weekly emphasized that these techniques represent a convergence of criminal and paramilitary thinking, control the human element as efficiently as possible, whether that be migrants, children, or even coerced fighters. The federal response in El Paso was swift. Raids were executed at 4 separate locations across the county, uncovering children hidden in ordinary suburban houses. These properties blended into working-class neighborhoods, carefully selected to avoid suspicion. Inside agents found not only evidence of smuggling, but also stark reminders of the children's ordeal, sparse bedding, limited food, and stockpiles of the tainted candy. Western legal analysts point out that the arrests 2 Mexican nationals and 2 American citizens reveal the cross-border nature of such enterprises. This was not simply a foreign problem spilling into the US, it was a cooperative network exploiting legal loopholes and weak oversight on both sides of the border. US Attorney Margaret Collins made clear that this was not a one-off, but part of a broader shift in tactics among trafficking organizations. From a military analyst's perspective, the incident highlights how non-state actors continually adapt under pressure. Just as insurgent groups in the Middle East innovate with improvised explosive devices or drones, when conventional tactics fail, traffickers adjust their methods to outpace law enforcement. The use of THC-laced candy may seem minor compared to advanced weaponry, but its strategic purpose is the same: minimize detection, maximize control, and maintain operational tempo. The El Paso case forces Americans to confront uncomfortable questions. If such tactics can be deployed in plain sight during school runs and family errands, how resilient are communities against future evolutions of trafficking strategies? The deeper federal investigators probed, the clearer the structure of the trafficking network became. This was not a disorganized group of opportunists, but a well-defined enterprise with compartmentalized roles, financial logistics, and international connections. 2 Mexican nationals, identified as Alejandro Vasquez Cruz and Maria Portillo Sanchez, served as recruiters. Their task was to find desperate families in Ciudad Juarez and surrounding areas, parents hoping to reunite their children with relatives in the United States. They promised safe passage in exchange for sums ranging from $3,000 to $7,000 per child. Once recruited, the children were handed off to the U.S. side of the operation, where 2 American citizens, Daniel Ramirez and Sonia Mendez, managed the domestic side of the pipeline. They coordinated housing in El Paso, arranged further transportation deeper into the American heartland, and facilitated money laundering. Evidence shows that additional conspirators still under investigation managed cross-border money transfers and possibly linked this network to others active in Arizona, New Mexico, and California. The operational design reveals how transnational criminal groups have embraced the logic of military supply chains. Each participant specialized in one part of the process, ensuring efficiency and reducing the risk that a single arrest would collapse the entire system. It mirrors the cell structure often used by insurgent groups, where the compromise of one unit does not endanger the whole. Homeland Security officials describe this as a corporate model of exploitation, with clear command lines and profit incentives. From a strategic perspective, this is not new. Similar structures have been documented in weapons trafficking from Russia into Ukraine, as noted by Defense News. Smuggling rings often mimic military logistics, compartmentalizing tasks so that arresting one courier does not reveal the financiers, and catching the financier does not immediately expose the recruiters. The El Paso network appears to have adopted this exact model, turning children into units of trade, managed and moved with chilling efficiency. Western intelligence experts warn that the overlap between narcotics, human trafficking, and transnational crime is deepening. In the same way, Iranian-backed groups in Syria use networks of civilians for cover, and movement cartels and smugglers along the US-Mexico border exploit family desperation as camouflage for profit. These operations are not isolated criminal acts. They are hybrid systems that combine elements of organized crime, covert logistics, and psychological warfare against vulnerable populations. The financial aspect also deserves attention. By charging thousands of dollars per child, traffickers tapped into an industry that, according to United Nations data, generates billions annually across the globe. In this case, the profits were laundered through US bank accounts and cryptocurrency wallets, a tactic increasingly favored by cartels to avoid traditional monitoring systems. Federal agents now believe the money trail may point to larger networks with ties to both narcotics smuggling and weapons transfers. For policymakers, this creates a strategic dilemma. If trafficking groups are adopting cell-based structures with multinational links, then dismantling them requires intelligence sharing across agencies and borders. Just as NATO coordinates military logistics to counter Russia in Eastern Europe, US law enforcement must coordinate with Mexican and even European partners to disrupt global trafficking supply chains. What remains most troubling, however, is not only the structure, but the cold calculation behind it. The traffickers viewed children not as human beings, but as commodities, units of revenue moved across a pipeline. By sedating them with THC, they sought to eliminate variables: no crying, no resistance, no attention drawn to law enforcement. It was a cruel efficiency, one that raises an urgent question for Americans watching these events unfold. If human traffickers can replicate military-style logistics within US borders, how long before these same methods are applied to other forms of criminal infiltration, from drugs to weapons to cybercrime? The physical and psychological toll inflicted on these children cannot be overstated. Toxicology reports confirmed deliberate dosing of THC, the psychoactive element in marijuana, tailored by weight to sedate children without causing immediate medical collapse. On paper, the smugglers may have considered this a controlled tactic, but in practice, it amounted to systematic chemical assault. Pediatric specialists warned that even minor doses of THC can disrupt neurodevelopment in children, impairing memory, attention, and emotional regulation. Dr. Maria Sanchez of El Paso Children's Hospital explained that repeated exposure can leave lasting scars on cognition, panic responses, and long-term mental health. Children reported feeling dizzy, frightened, and disoriented when questioned by social workers after the raids. The psychological trauma extended far beyond the chemicals. Imagine believing you were being taken to safety, only to be drugged into silence and treated as cargo. This betrayal of trust compounds the harm and creates lifelong challenges with anxiety attachment and resilience. Experts in child trauma have emphasized that the recovery process will require years of specialized care therapy and stable guardianship. The trauma of these children mirrors experiences from conflict zones abroad. Reports from Ukraine and Gaza in 2025 show that children subjected to forced sedation or chemical exposure during evacuations often suffer from chronic fear and post-traumatic stress. The tactics may differ, but the results are the same: children stripped of their sense of security. Western observers point to an alarming convergence: criminal groups and conflict actors alike exploiting medical science not to heal but to control. The impact ripples outward. Families who trusted smugglers with their children's safety now live with the devastation of betrayal. Many had paid thousands of dollars under the belief that their children would be reunited with loved ones in the United States. Instead, they found themselves entangled in a nightmare of federal investigations and medical emergencies. This dynamic reflects a wider phenomenon: traffickers rely on desperation as currency. Where poverty, violence, or war create despair, criminal groups offer false solutions. From a seasoned analyst's perspective, this case underscores how vulnerable populations remain the preferred targets of exploitation worldwide. Whether in El Paso or in refugee camps along the Polish border, criminals identify weaknesses, children, migrants, or displaced civilians, and use them to generate profit or strategic advantage. The deliberate sedation of minors with THC is only one manifestation of a global trend in which the powerless are weaponized by those seeking financial or political gain. It also forces the military and law enforcement community to confront new layers of threat. Chemical manipulation, once considered a tool of unconventional warfare, now appears in border smuggling operations. Defense experts at NATO's Center of Excellence for Military Medicine have raised alarms that non-lethal chemical control could be adapted not only for trafficking, but also for destabilization campaigns. A few sedated children may be a crime. Hundreds could become a humanitarian crisis. What makes this evolution particularly disturbing is its simplicity. THC-laced candy requires no advanced laboratory, no sophisticated weapon system. It requires only intent and cruelty. That accessibility means the tactic could be replicated elsewhere in Europe's migrant corridors and Asia's trafficking routes, or even in domestic criminal enterprises within the United States. In the same way improvised explosive devices spread from Iraq to Afghanistan to Africa, so too could this method proliferate. The larger strategic concern is that if child smugglers can normalize sedation as part of their toolkit, other criminal actors may escalate to more dangerous substances. Synthetic opioids already devastating communities across the United States could easily be adapted for similar purposes. What happens when the line between narcotics trafficking and human trafficking fully disappears? This grim reality leaves communities, policymakers, and security forces with hard questions. How can law enforcement detect chemical manipulation in real time? Can communities be educated to spot subtle signs of sedation in children? And most importantly, how can societies protect the most vulnerable when criminals continuously innovate new forms of exploitation? The raids that followed the El Paso traffic stop were executed with military precision. ICE and Homeland Security investigations launched simultaneous operations at 4 locations across El Paso County, uncovering not only evidence of smuggling, but also the stark conditions in which the children were kept. Sparse rooms, minimal bedding, and carefully hidden caches of the THC-laced candy painted a chilling picture of how normalized the exploitation had become. Agents described the scene as both methodical and dehumanizing children, warehoused like shipments awaiting distribution. Federal prosecutors wasted no time. On September 15th, charges were announced against 4 individuals, Mexican nationals, Alejandro Vasquez Cruz, aged 38, and Maria Portillo Sanchez, aged 42, alongside U.S. citizens Daniel Ramirez, aged 35, and Sonia Mendez, aged 29. Their indictments included conspiracy to smuggle minors, distribution of controlled substances to children, child endangerment, harboring illegal aliens, and money laundering. If convicted on all counts, each faces between 15 and 25 years in federal prison, yet officials made clear this was not the end of the story. Intelligence gathered during the raid suggested the network was tied to operations in Arizona, New Mexico, and California, potentially part of a broader cartel strategy. From an analytical perspective, the way these raids unfolded highlights a broader truth. Dismantling trafficking networks is rarely final. Just as military campaigns in the Middle East have shown removing one cell often leads to the rise of another, Western analysts have repeatedly stressed that these networks adapt quickly, replacing arrested operatives with new recruits and shifting tactics almost overnight. The El Paso bust may have struck a blow, but it is unlikely to stop the wider trend. Prosecutors acknowledged this, with U.S. Attorney Margaret Collins stating, "We are under no illusion that this is the only group using these tactics." Her words echo the warnings of NATO strategists who see trafficking not only as a criminal problem, but as a hybrid threat with geopolitical implications. In Eastern Europe, war-driven displacement has already fueled similar smuggling rings, and Western officials worry that chemical sedation techniques could migrate to those environments. The legal proceedings themselves will be closely watched. Convictions could set new precedents for prosecuting traffickers who chemically manipulate their victims. Legal experts point out that adding controlled substance charges raises the severity of penalties and could create a stronger deterrent. Yet they caution that deterrence alone will not suffice against organizations motivated by enormous profits and embedded in transnational structures. The raids also exposed a troubling technological component. Investigators found evidence of cryptocurrency transactions and encrypted messaging platforms used to coordinate logistics. These tools mirror those employed by extremist groups and state-backed actors alike. It suggests that trafficking groups are no longer isolated criminals, but are adopting technologies once thought exclusive to sophisticated intelligence operations. For U.S. security planners, the overlap is alarming. Criminals, terrorists, and hostile states increasingly share the same logistical playbook. Public reaction in El Paso was immediate. Local communities expressed shock that such operations had been running inside ordinary neighborhoods without raising suspicion. Schools and welfare agencies began reviewing policies to detect signs of sedation in children, while law enforcement rolled out new training protocols at border checkpoints. The message was clear: vigilance had to increase, not only at the border, but also within American communities. The broader geopolitical climate amplifies the urgency. In the same month these raids occurred, Western intelligence reported that Russian-linked networks were expanding trafficking operations in Eastern Europe, using profits to finance logistics for the war in Ukraine. Simultaneously, tensions between Israel and Iran raised fears that smuggling routes in the Middle East could double as corridors for both human and weapons trafficking. The El Paso case therefore is not an isolated tragedy, but part of a global pattern where children, migrants, and civilians become pawns in larger conflicts. This reality raises difficult questions. If the US homeland can host such sophisticated trafficking pipelines, what safeguards must be built to prevent escalation? And more critically, how can America and its allies disrupt networks that operate seamlessly across borders, currencies, and technologies? The revelations from El Paso highlight a deeper strategic reality. For US border security, trafficking networks are not static, and their evolving methods challenge the very foundation of national defense. The use of THC-laced candy to control children underscores how non-state actors continuously innovate, borrowing from techniques seen in conflict zones and adapting them to evade detection. For seasoned analysts, this represents a disturbing convergence organized crime adopting the logic of hybrid warfare. Federal agencies have responded by tightening screening procedures, particularly at border checkpoints. New training modules now teach agents how to identify subtle signs of sedation in minors, drooping eyelids, incoherent speech, and disorientation. Yet training alone may not be enough. Experts at the Rand Corporation caution that cartels possess both the resources and the adaptability to stay one step ahead. They compare the current struggle to the cyber arms race. As defenders patch vulnerabilities, attackers find new exploits. Strategically, this case also reveals the vulnerability of US communities beyond the border. Safe houses in El Paso neighborhoods went unnoticed for months, a reminder that trafficking does not stop at the checkpoint. It infiltrates the heartland. Western observers draw parallels to Europe, where migrant smuggling networks have moved from coastal entry points deep into Germany, France, and beyond. For NATO allies, the lesson is clear: porous borders anywhere can quickly evolve into threats everywhere. The global dimension cannot be ignored. In 2025, Reuters reported a surge in child trafficking cases linked to war zones in Ukraine and the Middle East. Displaced populations create opportunities for smugglers, and criminal organizations often move in parallel with arms dealers, creating a pipeline that serves both human and military exploitation. If children in Texas can be subdued with THC-laced candy, what prevents traffickers in Eastern Europe or Asia from adapting similar methods, possibly with far more dangerous substances? The implications for the United States under President Trump's administration are profound. Washington has already signaled an intention to tighten cross-border coordination with Mexico, while simultaneously pressing NATO allies to increase intelligence sharing on trafficking networks linked to Russian and Iranian interests. Defense News recently reported that trafficking routes are being used as testbeds for covert weapons transfers, blurring the line between crime and geopolitics. In this sense, El Paso becomes more than a law enforcement case. It is a case study in modern security challenges that combine crime technology and international rivalries. For communities, the challenge is equally pressing. Public awareness campaigns now stress the warning signs: children traveling with adults who cannot provide basic details, minors who appear sedated, and groups of children with no apparent familial ties. ICE has reinforced its tip line, urging Americans to see vigilance as part of national defense. The call is not only for law enforcement, but for every citizen who might encounter suspicious circumstances. From a strategic lens, this is the battle for resilience. Just as NATO builds deterrence through readiness, the United States must build deterrence against traffickers by denying them easy methods of concealment. That means better technology at ports of entry, deeper collaboration with international partners, and investment in community education. Analysts argue that without such a comprehensive approach, traffickers will continue to innovate, shifting from THC to opioids, from candy to other covert delivery systems. The larger question remains: how prepared is America, and by extension the West, to confront trafficking networks that function with the sophistication of military operations? Can alliances like NATO adapt to see human trafficking not just as a humanitarian crisis, but as a strategic security threat? And perhaps most importantly, how can societies balance the immediate need to protect vulnerable children with the long-term fight against the criminal enterprises that exploit them? The El Paso child trafficking case exposed one of the most disturbing evolutions in cross-border crime: children sedated with THC-laced candy to ensure silence during smuggling operations. What began as a routine traffic stop quickly escalated into a multi-agency investigation uncovering a transnational network that mirrored military logistics in its precision and compartmentalization. Mexican recruiters, US-based handlers, and financial managers coordinated to move minors like commodities, charging families thousands under false promises of safety. The medical consequences were severe. Pediatric specialists warned of lasting cognitive and psychological damage compounded by the trauma of betrayal. Raids across El Paso revealed children warehoused in suburban safe houses, highlighting how deeply trafficking can penetrate ordinary communities. Federal prosecutors indicted 4 individuals, but investigators believe the network extends into Arizona, New Mexico, and California. Strategically, the case demonstrates how trafficking groups adopt hybrid methods, blending crime, narcotics, and technology. Analysts warn of parallels to conflict zones in Ukraine and the Middle East, where displaced populations are exploited with similar tactics. For the US and its NATO allies, the lesson is clear: trafficking is no longer just a criminal problem. It is a security challenge with global implications.